What are you most interested in reading about?
Oh, I read a lot of environmental nonfiction, but
Mm.
basically just like things about climate, about the environment, just whatever else. I mean, I have a nonprofit that supports solar projects around the world, basically like
Mm-hmm.
environmental nonprofit,
Mm-hmm.
and so that kind of I founded that sort of as a result of a lot of different reading. And I mean, we've been talking about the expeditions and travel and all that. I mean, it's hard not to go on trips like that and feel like you should be doing something useful.
I feel like there's a part of me that's like, obviously, climate change is happening. And then there's another part of me that's like, I've watched videos where climate change happens on a macro level in ebbs and flows in history of the world. And like, what if you're on a rise? Is that part of it? Then there's other people that don't think it's happening at all. Like, what is the reality of it from your perspective?
Well, it's not even from my perspective. I think this is an example where you can say there is an objective reality. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like the climate is changing. I mean, it's just you know how quickly, to what extent. It's like, yeah, scientists still quibble over some details, but it's like climate change is reality,
Right.
and it's happening. You know, the whole macro scale stuff basically doesn't apply to the scale of change that we're experiencing. You know, for your line of work, you're not like in nature quite as much, but
Dude, I'm killing nature. I killed
yeah,
nature.
that's true.
I burned
You
fuel
are.
as fast as I can. The more fuel I burned, the faster I went. So I was not in the most conscientious form of work.
Yeah, totally. Well, never too late
True.
to change that. Over the course of my life, I can physically see how forests have changed in California, how glaciers have receded. It's like, or I was talking about Patagonia. I've done 4 or 5 expeditions there. Just in the last 6 years, some of the glaciers have receded enough that you now hike in different ways to the mountains. Like you used to hike around the south
Oh,
side of
wow.
the lake. Now you hike around the north side of the lake because the
Oh,
lake is
wow.
twice as big because the glacier has receded so much. And so when you see that kind of change happening at that kind of scale, because it's easy to be like, oh, macro changes. Like Yosemite used to be glaciated and then the glaciers retreated. And you're like, yeah, they did over thousands of years, not over the course of one human lifespan. Basically, it's like if you can physically see change yourself, it's like that the timeline is totally out of control.
Mm.
It's like that's why I find it surprising that there's so much climate denial, and actually, I mean, more so in the U.S. than the rest of the world. But it's surprising because even if you're like the most staunch climate denier, it's like you can see that the flowers in your garden bloom at different times than they did when you were a kid. Like
Yeah.
wildfire season in California is like completely different scale than it was even 10 or 20 years ago.
Right. What are the things that need to be done to really make a difference? And, I mean, I feel like me driving a car that doesn't burn gasoline and battery powered is an option, but maybe it's the big, factory down the road that is like, my car is a whisper on the wind compared to something
Totally.
like that. So like what are the big things that are really going to move the needle?
Well, that's the challenge. I mean, there's always the sort of contrast between personal lifestyle changes versus policy sort of issues.
Right.
I mean, I think that in the U.S., there's always been a focus on personal change. Where like, what should you be doing? Like, you should, drive green, like go electric, or go, drive a hybrid, or things like that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you should turn down your thermostat, things like that. Basically like limit your impact. And that all makes sense. And I think, people should at least think about those things and do what they can. But the most important things are the policy things. I mean, like voting, like making sure that the government is steering the ship in the right direction, basically. It's like you can make certain lifestyle choices. Like basically, if new homes aren't built with natural gas hookups, then lo and behold, nobody's burning natural gas. I think it's important that the default choices get greener. I personally sort of don't like the putting the onus on individual action, because the reality is that most people in the US like don't have the bandwidth and the energy or even the finances to like make the green choice all the time. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, I think what needs to be done is that the default choices need to be made a little bit greener. So like building codes, like slightly denser communities with public transportation, let's say, or like, I mean, if new homes are required to be net zero, so like produce their own power, so they have solar, they don't have gas hookups, things like that. It's like those are kind of obvious, like relatively easy things that are put into code that wind up making an individual's life much, much greener without them actually having to put any effort into it.
Probably, I'm going to guess the snag that comes along with that is that it's probably going to cost some money, like probably things.
Some of that though is the upfront cost is a little bit higher, but then the life cycle cost is much lower. The thing with solar and stuff like that, it's like, yeah, it costs a little bit more ahead of time, but then you don't have a utility bill, let's say.
Yeah.
And so, over the lifetime of ownership, it's actually, you save quite a bit of money, but it's just, there's a higher hurdle to clear. But that's where smart policy decisions need to come in. It's like, that's where there's a place for government and like tax breaks and things like that. And, because those are the kinds of things where I'm like, it's not fundamentally harder to build, like not having gas hookups, like can be cheaper actually. I mean, when you put a new natural gas hookup into a building, it costs like $1,500 to like hook it up to the meter and everything. It's like, it's not fundamentally more expensive. It's just that it's slightly different and people aren't used to doing it that way. And it's just not the status quo for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Bill McKibben is like a really renowned environmental activist who's like worked with 350.org a bunch. And he's written a ton of books about the environment in different ways. But basically the premise of E-Arth was that we're already living on an Earth that isn't the Earth that we remember from childhood, which is kind of what I was actually just talking about. Where like when my grandparents talked about what the world is like we don't live in that world anymore. Like there are already, more than 100 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere, more than there were when our grandparents were kids. It's like, and that literally changes every aspect of the earth. Like the ocean is more acidic, which means that the shellfish, like mollusks and things, make more brittle shells, and like eggs don't form in the same way. It's like we've literally changed every ecosystem on Earth already.
I think also about regenerative farming, and I think about, hearing from a few different people that I've interviewed that we have 60 or 70 harvests left in our soil, and we're just treating our planet pretty crappy. And, regenerative farming, I think, is one of those things too, that is, more efficient over time, but, you have to learn how to do it.
And that to me is another example of like policy things where you're like, why isn't that the default? It's like, why not just be like everything should be that way? Or like, if it's a smarter way to do it and it's better long-term, it's like, why not just do that? It's like, it's easy to imagine a world that's better in a lot of ways. And you're like, why not implement some of those things?